Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Tehran vowing revenge against the Zionists following a mysterious explosion at the Natanz nuclear enrichment facility. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Netanyahu pushing back against ICC investigations. And finally, to vaccinate kids or not to vaccinate kids? That is the question. So stay tuned for the answer. A massive blackout reported at Iran's underground Natanz nuclear facility on Sunday. Experts saying the mysteriously caused crisis could set the nuclear facility back at least 9 months. And Tehran vowing to take revenge after blaming the Zionists for the incident.
حادثه تروریستی در نتنز در پی حادثه صبح امروز در تأسیسات هسته‌ای نتنز رئیس سازمان انرژی اتمی این اقدام رو تروریستی خوند. از آژانس بین‌المللی انرژی اتمی خواست برخورد کنه و البته گفت که ایران حق اقدام علیه عاملان و آمران و مباشران این تروریسم هسته‌ای رو برای خودش محفوظ میدونه.
Just hours after new advanced centrifuges started running on Iran's National Nuclear Technology Day, the Natanz nuclear facility in Iran shutting down. And the cause? A mysterious blackout, allegedly in part by Israel's hands, that officials in Iran are calling an act of nuclear terrorism. In fact, according to reports by the New York Times, quoting unnamed American and Israeli intelligence authorities, the blackout, originally pegged as a cyber attack, follows a deliberately planned explosion, which completely destroyed the internal power systems supporting the underground facility and its centrifuges, which are used to enrich uranium. The Natanz nuclear program likely being set back at least 9 months, according to reports, as a result. This just as United States Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin arriving in Israel for his historic 2-day visit, the first such visit to Israel by a senior representative from the Biden administration, in which Iran is said to be the main topic. Meanwhile, while neither confirming nor denying having a hand in the incident, Prime Minister Netanyahu did have this to say at a ceremony for Israeli military and intelligence chiefs ahead of the country's 73rd Independence Day.
המאבק באיראן וגרורותיה, המאבק בהתגרענות האיראנית, המאבק בהתחמשות האיראנית, הוא משימה ענקית. המצב שקיים היום לא אומר שהוא יהיה המצב שיהיה קיים מחר. קשה מאוד להסביר את מה שחוללנו פה במעבר הזה מאפסות, מחוסר אונים מוחלט שלא היה כמו דוגמתו בתולדות העמים, לכוח העולמי, כן, שהצלחנו לייצר כאן, בוודאי אזורי, אבל בדברים מסוימים עולמי.
Then Netanyahu going on to add that he wishes for all of those present to, quote, continue holding the sword of David in their hands, end quote. As for Iran, amidst indirect talks with the United States to potentially return to the JCPOA and lift American sanctions on Tehran, Foreign Affairs Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif vowing revenge against the Zionists, especially as Jerusalem has consistently stated that Israel will not allow a nuclear Iran.
In the Middle East, there is no threat that is more serious, more dangerous, more pressing than that posed by the fanatical regime in Iran. Iran continues to support terrorists around the world in 5 continents, threatening civilians everywhere. Iran has never given up its quest for nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them. And Iran consistently and outrageously calls for Israel's annihilation and works towards that goal. Mr. Secretary, we both know the horrors of war. We both understand the importance of preventing war, and we both agree that Iran must never possess nuclear weapons. My policy as Prime Minister of Israel is clear. I will never allow Iran to obtain the nuclear capability to carry out its genocidal goal of eliminating Israel. And Israel will continue to defend itself against Iran's aggression and terrorism.
Finally, this alleged Israeli attack also being the second such setback at Natanz, following a fire in July for which Iran similarly is blaming Jerusalem. Joining me now with more on the blackout at the Natanz nuclear facility, political analyst and professor at State University of New York Maritime College, Mark Meirowitz. Mark, thank you so much for being with us. Now, United States Secretary of Defense Austin is in Israel right now to discuss the threats posed by Iran's Ayatollah regime. What are the chances that he or anyone in the Biden administration were given the heads up before the alleged attack?
I mean, how would I know that? I would say the answer to your question is more what my professor in my first poli-sci course told me is the most important thing. Cui bono, who benefits? And I think the end game here is, of course, Israel benefits, but I think the United States benefits as well, because this will postpone, I believe, the progress of Iran in developing a nuclear weapon, and that will buy some time. In other words, Iran's strategy is always to pressure the United States, stating we are going to have a nuclear weapon in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. So unless you make a deal with us, we're going to have a nuclear weapon. Now this will this will be a setback for them. So if it's who benefits, then the U.S. benefits, and I think the world benefits to the extent that Iran is slowed down in terms of development of a nuclear weapon, which clearly is what it is planning to do and has been planning since day one to do, notwithstanding all the things that they say at these negotiations.
So in line with that, is it in Israel's best interest to ask for permission or for forgiveness from the United States with respect to committing such attacks, or even ahead of attacks on Iranian vessels at the Red Sea? Do you think that the United States prefers plausible deniability or the chance to reject Israeli actions?
I would move this discussion to another venue, which is the question of how this is accepted domestically in the United States Senate, United States House, and the administration, and how does this all affect the progress of the Iran deal? And there, I think, is, so I think we're going to move forward beyond this point. I think the visit of Defense Secretary Austin, I believe, know intimately, is intended to, to calm the situation down and make sure that there's no further retaliation back and forth. We've seen it in the ship attacks, now in the Natanz attack. So the United States wants to do this deal. They have put this as their priority. The question is, can it be, halted, or can it be slowed to a point where it will not develop? And I think that it's going to be very difficult to slow it down. I think that that's the main focus at the present time. If you listen to Defense Secretary Austin, I think he didn't mention Iran, but he did talk about Israel's qualitative military edge and the fact that Israel's supplying Israel with weaponry and so forth, and the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, I believe, is a signal to Israel not to accelerate the situation beyond where the United States cannot reach the deal with Iran. I mean, it's a very fraught and difficult situation. You look at the timing of it also, which is pretty impactful, that this happened right around the time that the defense secretary is visiting. So again, I wouldn't be able to speculate, but everything is connected in politics. So obviously it will have an impact. And I think the United States and Israel have the relationship where they can talk to each other about these things. And certainly, I suppose they've collaborated in the past on certain things like this as well.
All right, Professor Mark Meirowitz, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you all. Bye.
All right, and for those of you who'd like to see the extended 10-minute interview with Professor Meirowitz, please check it out online. In the meantime, again, Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Now, moving on, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu publicly refusing now to cooperate with the International Criminal Court's inquiry into alleged Israeli war crimes. Hannah Rifkin reporting.
Ahead of a Friday deadline to respond to an ICC notification letter, Israel announcing its refusal to cooperate with The Hague, while the Palestinians expressing eagerness to work with the controversial court.
איזה אבסורד, איזו צביעות. בית הדין בהאג הוקם בהשראת בית הדין בנירנברג, ששפט פושעי מלחמה נאצים אחרי מלחמת העולם השנייה. אבל מנירנברג להאג קרה היפוך מוחלט. גוף שהוקם כדי להגן על זכויות אדם, הפך לגוף שבפועל מגן על מי שרומס את זכויות האדם.
Back in March, the ICC officially launching an inquiry to investigate alleged war crimes charges against Israel for its settlement activity, its actions in the 2014 Gaza war, and the 2018-2019 Gaza border riots, labeled as the Great March of Return. But while Prime Minister Netanyahu is taking a more passive approach in denouncing the investigation and rejecting the ICC's jurisdiction, the Israeli Yesha Council launching a more diplomatic initiative against the ICC war crimes suits. The Yesha Council, which represents multiple municipalities of Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria, planning on sending a folder to The Hague in the coming weeks, explaining both that the region known as the West Bank is not occupied and that Israel's presence there is in fact good for the Palestinians. The Yesha document reportedly laying out a biblical, historical, legal, security, and economic rationale for Israel's claim to the land, as well as its rights to building Jewish communities. That said, while the initiative is clearly intended to present Israel in a bright light, the Council arguing that it's simply seeking for the ICC and international diplomats to fully understand the truth of the situation.
In other news, Israel's top court upholding Education Minister Yoav Gallant's move to withhold the prestigious Israel Prize from one of this year's nominees, and all due to the professor's alleged political views. Film director and prize recipient Michal Bat Adam, meantime, protesting Education Minister Gallant's move to block mathematics and computer science professor Oded Goldreichs from receiving this year's prize over claims that he supports the BDS movement against Israel.
אני מאוד שמחה לקבל את הפרס, ואני מאוד עצובה שאנחנו 4:04 הערב, בגלל שחסר כאן זוכה אחד.
Similarly, rectors from 7 of Israel's 9 research universities also protesting the decision, arguing that Gallant doesn't even have the authority to withhold the annual award. This while Israel's top court saying that the professor could be awarded the prize at a later date. In any case, Goldreich, for his part, rejecting the accusations that he supports BDS, though he did sign a letter in March calling for the EU to halt funding for Ariel University over its alleged legitimization of Israeli settler activity. Now, as coronavirus rates continue to be wrestled under control, Israeli authorities working to make sure that it stays that way. Israel's Pediatrics Association announcing now plans to cooperate with Pfizer and BioNTech in vaccinating kids under 16 years old as soon as possible. But not every doctor is on board. Over 90 Israeli physicians penning a letter urging the government to hold off on such a move, at least until more evidence is gathered. And here to discuss is president of the Israel Pediatrics Association, Professor Tzachi Grossman, and Dr. Yoav Yechezkeli, specialist in internal medicine and medical management and lecturer in the program for disaster and emergency management at Tel Aviv University. Thank you both so much for being with us. Now, Professor Grossman, I'll start with you. Why is it so important to vaccinate kids, especially when the infections are already dropping without their inoculation?
Well, the problem is that when we look on the year that have passed and we analyze the morbidity of children, everybody says that the morbidity was mild and very few children got sick. And this is not true because we are happy that children were less severely hit than adults, but still we had close to 1,000 hospitalizations. We had 120 of these with severe disease, either corona or the delayed cardiovascular syndrome. We had 50 children admitted to intensive care units, and unfortunately we had also 7 kids that died, of whom 2 at least were without any background comorbidities. So this pandemic can have a hard effect on children. And the numbers are going down happily, but we must remember that in pandemics and in general infectious diseases, they can rise again, and we don't want to see again children suffering from this. We know that in every disease like measles and so on, there are ups and downs, and the diseases are never away for good. So we would like to protect children as well as we're protecting adults.
All right, now, Dr. Yechezkeli, you're one of the signatories who are against vaccinating kids for the time being. What are your primary concerns?
Look, every medical treatment that we give, including vaccinations, is checked according to is it needed, is it effective, and is it safe? And the threshold to decide about that in giving vaccinations to healthy individuals is otherwise than giving medications to sick people or people who are in grave condition. So I argue that the disease in children is mild, is not severe. The numbers Professor Grossman showed, really every child is a whole world, and we should strive to minimize the suffering of all children. But still, looking at the statistics and also in comparison with other diseases like even the flu in previous winter seasons, there were much more severely affected kids from flu in the years before. So this is the children are not vulnerable to the coronavirus. And on the contrast, the vulnerable population, like the elderly and people with chronic diseases, most of them, happily, at least in Israel, most of them are already vaccinated. So I don't see really the reason why to vaccinate children right now.
So can I ask you a follow-up, Dr. Yechezkeli? What would it take to change your mind? Is that an option?
Of course, it's an option. We don't say do not vaccinate children. We say for now, the evidence, the data that we have, including the data from the research the manufacturer have done in this age group from 12 to 16 is not enough. It's still short term, not enough children. And by the way, it was not even published. It was just given like a press release and without any peer review. So we still have to see the data to be convinced that, especially from the safety point of view, look, in medicine, there is a great principle. First, do not do harm. We should really be sure. I want, as a physician, to be sure, and I want to be convinced that not more harm is done than effectiveness by giving this vaccination.
So, Professor Grossman, back to you. How do you respond to Dr. Yechezkeli and his concerns?
Yes, I'm very happy that he raised the issue of the study again, but I would like to clarify. First of all, this study on the 12 to 15 years adolescents was appropriately done and according to rigorous scientific criteria how to conduct a study in a follow-up population. And you remember we all had the results from the first study in December on adults, on 40,000 adults, and the follow-up study is designed differently. And this is based on rules that were not invented yesterday or the day before. There are rules how to conduct a study on a follow-up population, like the adolescents in our case. It can be a shorter study, it can be on less patients, and the main parameter is the immunologic power of the vaccine, the number of antibodies created. So it has slightly different targets, and the study is according to these criteria exactly. And looking on possible side effects, we know, we heard these doubts before the vaccine rollout in Israel began. After the Pfizer study, everybody said, okay, this is only 40,000 participants, but what will happen if we vaccinate millions of citizens? And we know that we vaccinated millions and nothing different happened from the safety profile from the study to the real world. And we exactly hope that this will the same happen with children. And I'm happy that Dr. Yechezkeli will be maybe ready to reconsider his position once he sees the FDA approval.
Right.
And maybe then he would be convinced that the risk, because we're talking about the risk now, that the risk is negligible. I'm very looking forward to it.
All right, well, I think we're all looking forward to the results of the FDA trials. Dr. Yechezkeli, Professor Grossman, thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, in another story, exciting news, H&M's sister chain and other stories planning to open multiple stores in Israel in the very near future. Israel expanding its fashion style, announcing on Sunday plans to open 2 stores of H&M's sister chain and other stories, the store being a supposedly more luxurious alternative to H&M. And while prices are higher than H&M's, customers get what they pay for, since the chain uses mostly natural fabrics. Meanwhile, And Other Stories is also planning on selling skincare products and makeup in stores, announcing the idea to have a giant sink inside each location for customers to test out the products. As for the actual ribbon cutting, the company's franchisee in Israel, Match Retail, saying that it'll open the stores in the 4th quarter of 2021. Now, for our final topic tonight, incredible news in the field of oncology. Researchers at Tel Aviv University revealing a potential breakthrough in the search for a cure for brain cancer. And here to tell us all about it, Professor Ronit Sachi-Fainaro, Director of the Cancer Biology Research Center and the head of the Cancer Research and Nanomedicine Laboratory at Tel Aviv University's Sackler Faculty of Medicine. Professor, thank you so much for being with us. Now, in plain terms, What did you discover?
Hi, good afternoon. What we discovered was that glioblastoma cells, those are the cancer cells in a very aggressive brain tumor, communicate with the immune cells in the brain and basically corrupt them for their own benefit, meaning that instead of the immune systems attacking the cancer cells and not allowing them to spread in the brain and grow in mass, they do exactly the opposite. Once they are corrupted and re-educated by the glioblastoma cells, they become partners, they become assets to help them and recruit blood vessels and allow them to spread and invade the brain tissue. And our main question was, how do they do that? And we know that cells in general communicate by proteins that they express. And we set to look for which protein is the one in charge or one of the main drivers of this communication. And we found P-selectin to be one of 500 proteins that is responsible for these interactions. And basically, when we inhibited it, when we blocked that, we blocked these tight, intimate interactions and sabotage the relationship of the cancer cells with the normal cells in the brain, not allowing them to help promote and progress this cancer.
So how did you go about doing this? Because you just mentioned that there were 500, I'm assuming even more proteins that are being expressed here. How did you narrow it down to one?
Well, we looked at models of brain cancer, of this aggressive brain cancer in animals, in mice, and we compared it to hundreds of slides of patients, of glioblastoma in patients. Moreover, we collaborated with neurosurgeons from Tel Aviv Medical Center, and we got, from the surgery room, we got a chunk of the tumor. The rest goes, of course, to pathology. We do it under consent forms, and patients know that it is going for research. And we stain that protein, and indeed we saw that our predictions that this protein is overexpressed, it is indeed communicating between the glioblastoma cells and the microglia, those immune cells. And we see that something different is different about this immune system, immune cells in the brain, from normal brains, healthy brains. We got healthy brains from Johns Hopkins and the Liver Institute. And once they provided us, we could compare and see that this protein is not present in the brain if there is no glioblastoma, and it rises up in its amount only when the glioblastoma cells are present and communicating and activating those immune cells in the brain, but in a negative way. Instead of inhibiting the process as any pathology, they support it and allow them to grow and spread in the brain.
Wow. All right. Well, I know that there are a huge number of different cancers. And so, first of all, I'm very excited to hear about this really exciting research and discovery that you've made. And hopefully it can lead to more breakthroughs in other types of cancer. In the meantime, Professor Saichi Fainaro, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
All right, now let's take a look at the weather forecast with Chana Rifkin.
Good evening. Temperatures are a bit chill tonight, but on the bright side, we'll have a starry clear sky. Lows expecting to range in the 40s or between 4 to 12 degrees Celsius. And tomorrow, highs reaching in the 60s or the 20s in Celsius. Now back to the studio.
And now, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. This is something you don't often see on mainstream media. An Israeli soldier playing soccer with Palestinian kids in Hebron. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.3 shekels to the American dollar and 2.62 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And don't forget to visit the all-new and improved ILTV website at iltv.tv and to subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates while you're there. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.